Nobody likes crossover episodes, and yet here we are. The world is now focused on two conflicts. Well, one more than another, but we will get to that. Naturally, one wonders how the outbreak of war in the Gaza Strip affects Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and vice versa. And indeed, that is our subject for today. The conventional wisdom is that this is bad news for Ukraine, because it will divide Washington's attention between the two conflicts. But just how bad will it be? In today's video, we will begin with the good news for the world overall, that this is not the lines on maps being drawn for a new Cold War. However, we will then discuss why the Gaza crisis presents serious problems for Ukraine. Nevertheless, there are some odd ways where the second war could benefit Kyiv. Justification for expanding artillery production capacity in Western countries, allowing for vote linkages in the US Congress, pushing the unhelpful 24/7 news cycle to something else, and diverting supply-constrained Iranian resources. Oh, and be prepared for me saying capacity constraints way too many times. But we begin with the happy note that we are not yet moving to nuclear apocalypse politics. This point is easy to miss. It seems like a line is being drawn, well, not a very clean one, but a line nonetheless, with Russia on one side and the West on the other. Ukraine has partnered with the West, while Iran has partnered with Russia. Meanwhile, Israel and Iran have a long-running rift, and Israel is so entrenched with the West that it caucuses with the Western European and Others group in the official United Nations geographic divisions. And yes, it actually is called that. Thus, Israel goes with the West, and Hamas appears to naturally fall in Russia's camp, just as it was during the glory days of the Cold War, and matching how the countries allocated resupply efforts during the Yom Kippur War 50 years earlier. The line seemingly further solidifies. But Middle East allegiances changed as the Soviet Union fell apart. Prior to 2022, Israel and Russia had friendly relations, with Israel's often Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu making frequent trips to Moscow. This included a special 25th anniversary party for the relationship, and he even attended the Victory Day parade in Moscow in 2018, normally seen on this channel because of the endless photos of military hardware that it provides. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the relationship has become more complicated. Within the United Nations, Israel has voted with the Western Bloc on 5 of the 6 emergency resolutions, with an abstention on the one that called for Russia to make reparations payments. However, Israel did not join the Western sanctions against Russia, and as the Gaza situation heated up, Netanyahu declined an offer from Zelensky for a solidarity visit. Summarizing the position, Israel was moderately annoyed by Russia's invasion, somewhere between China and NATO on the spectrum. Meanwhile, Putin has expressed sympathy for Israel's plight with Hamas. This carries over a long-running policy push dating back to the Chechen Wars. Putin was the first leader to call George W. Bush to offer condolences and support on September 11th. It was a savvy political opportunity to unite global resistance to extremism, at a time when the Kremlin's website only uploaded potato-quality images. Sorry about that. In any case, the thing about indiscriminate attacks is that, well, they are indiscriminate. With that in mind, it will not surprise you to find out that at least 16 Russians died in Hamas's attack. This has not exactly pleased Russia. The headline message to Israel was therefore one of sympathy for suffering an unprecedented attack. But Putin has simultaneously emphasized Moscow's even longer-running relationship with the Arab world, and has made strong pleas for Israel to moderate its response. Thus, the battle lines are not as solidified as they may first seem. The world, in a word, is complicated. So we are not about to descend into World War III. But how will the outbreak of conflict in Gaza affect what is happening in Ukraine, and vice versa? The basic perception is that this is not great news for policymakers in Kyiv. To summarize, Gaza is a distraction. Biden and other US policymakers have a limited number of hours per day. Whatever time is spent handling the situation in Israel implicitly is time spent away from managing the problems in Ukraine. Militarily, the problem seems starker. Both Ukraine and Israel would benefit from arms assistance. The two parties fighting over the apparently scarce resources of a single benefactor creates a zero-sum dynamic, where whatever goes to Ukraine does not go to Israel, and vice versa. To wit, the United States has kept a stockpile of artillery in Israel since the Yom Kippur War. I guess they don't like photos being taken there, so there was only this potato-quality image of it. Yeah, more potatoes for today. But at least the United States Navy is kind enough to supply high-quality images of actual potatoes. Anyway, the munitions belong to the US Armed Forces, but stationing them in Israel means that donations can be handed out more quickly in the event of a crisis. At some point during Russia's invasion, as Ukraine became shell-starved, the United States began transferring some of this reserve supply northward. But now with Hamas causing a crisis in Israel, those shells would conceivably stay where they are. Still, the zero-sum framing of arms aid is misguided for a couple of reasons. The simpler of the two is that the demand for armaments between the two is not completely identical. Yes, the 155mm artillery shells will be a point of contention. But the battle spaces for Ukraine and Israel are about as distinct as they can be. Israel is right on top of Gaza. Moreover, Gaza is a strip, so the potential targets are not running very deep. And the high population density means that Washington is not exactly thrilled with the idea of using weapons with a wide blast radius. In contrast, Ukraine has large targets that it would like to hit hundreds of kilometers away. That means that a missile like ATACMS is helpful for Ukraine, while not being particularly useful for Israel. And after months of rumors, they appeared to make their debut in Ukraine shortly after the crisis in Gaza began. But the bigger point is that the United States is not capacity constrained in any meaningful sense, as both Biden and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen were both yelling to anyone in earshot about. Both the money and the potential production capacity exist to fuel two wars at the same time. Instead, the real constraints have been political. Congressional Republicans with questions about the return on the investment, and the executive branch with concerns about escalation dynamics with Russia. Israel's war has few direct effects on either point. The closest issue is that much of the strife within the US House of Representatives is about reducing budget expenditures. Granting larger outlays for Israel means a tighter constraint for other purposes, including what had been going to Ukraine. But Ukraine military aid is a tiny fraction of defense spending. Over the first 18 months of the war, the United States spent $46.6 billion in security assistance, weapons, and equipment, or about $30 billion per year. By comparison, U.S. military spending is about $800 billion annually. So again, it is not really money that is constraining here. It is political desire. That said, there are specific components within the broader U.S. security apparatus that will have a hard time doing two things at once. For example, the more time that U.S. intelligence uses to sort out who was responsible for bombing a hospital, the less time they can spend forwarding targets for Ukrainian missiles. Training intelligence analysts takes longer than expanding ammunition production, so there are clear short-term constraints here. But broadly speaking, Washington commands enough military power to handle two problems at once. This is in contrast to, say, humanitarian organizations, which are perennially underfunded and understaffed, and will struggle to handle two fronts at the same time. One place with starker problems for Ukraine is on the economic side, and involves a potential expansion of the Gaza crisis to Iran. Quick recap there. Israel was negotiating to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia are long-running regional adversaries, though. Thus, there is speculation, but crucially no confirmation, that Iran played a role in Hamas's attack. Aside from that, Iran has made various threats about intervening in the conflict should Israel cross some alleged red lines. Or alternatively, it could use its proxy, Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, for that purpose. However, if things spiral out of control, all eyes will shift toward the Strait of Hormuz. It is this tiny little opening in the Persian Gulf. And look what is inside of it. Oil. 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 Oil everywhere. In fact, about a fifth of the world's traded oil, and a third of its liquid natural gas, is exported through the strait. If Iran wants to make a power play, it could try shutting down the shipping lanes. Whether Iran is successful in that goal or not is beside the point. Energy prices will soar either way. That matters because Russia is trying to pay for its invasion with energy exports. Russian energy still sells at a discount compared to the standard global prices, but it remains responsive to the market. If clean gas prices go up, in the political sense, not in the carbon sense, so too will dirty Russian gas. This will create a headache for the Western coalition trying to starve Russia's economy into submission, especially at a time when Russia is facing a new bout of economic problems at home. Although the Gaza crisis may be a net negative for Ukraine, it is not all doom and gloom. Let's start by going back to the 155mm shell problem. As we have discussed before, part of the reason Ukraine is shell-hungry is a mismatch in the incentives for weapons manufacturers and what the government might want. Investing in new production capacity requires an expensive upfront outlay. They are only willing to do this if they anticipate raking in the money on the back end with long-term sales. So far, it appears that manufacturers are skeptical that the war in Ukraine will last long enough to recoup the investment. Meanwhile, governments have been unwilling to guarantee purchases that would otherwise solve the problem. Given the mismatch in traditional military power, one imagines that the Hamas-Israel conflict will end first, or at least what we used to call major combat operations will end first. An occupation afterward could last longer, but that requires a different weapons set. As such, I would not anticipate that arms manufacturers will unilaterally invest in new production capacity as a consequence of it. However, if it does convince NATO leaders that stimulating investment is unavoidable to cover the short-term gaps, you might end up in a situation where Ukraine is the long-run beneficiary. Another benefit could arise in vote linkages on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. To grossly simplify congressional policy preferences, the further you go left, the more support you see for Ukraine. However, Republicans hold a narrow majority in the House, and as long as they caucus together to control which legislation makes it to the floor, there are not enough staunchly pro-Ukraine moderate Republicans to overcome that deficit. This is despite a supermajority of Americans supporting Ukraine, and even a narrow plurality within the Republican Party doing the same. It is worth noting here, though, that the questions about expanding aid are more nuanced, particularly on the Republican side. But interpreting those polls is difficult, because maintaining aid levels will require continued resolutions for a stream of funds. It turns out that when you fight wars, surprisingly, things get destroyed and need to be replaced. In any case, the result has been congressional pushback against deeper Ukraine spending. The upshot is that the further right you go, the stauncher support you see for Israel. Given that the United States is not monetarily constrained, this opens up the possibility for funding bills to combine together the issues. In other words, whereas funding bills in isolation could face difficulties passing the House, the Senate, and the Oval Office, a combined spending bill could obtain bipartisan support. In that sense, the Gaza crisis does not make funding Ukraine inherently more difficult. Connected to that is the benefit of the distraction. Part of the issue with Republican support for Ukraine funding is the party base. That is, a number of representatives broadly believe that weakening Russia is worth the investment of US military funds, but worry that voting as such would invite primary challengers, who would then soak up the support of the party base. Some of that may be because when voters answer questions like those from earlier, they do not have a good sense of how much money is actually being spent on Ukraine, nor how that compares to the overall spending figures, nor that what the funds mostly do is subsidize new American weapons, with Ukraine receiving the outdated surplus. This knowledge gap was part of the purpose behind Biden's October 19th primetime address from the Oval Office, to persuade voters with information they may have been unaware of. How effective that will be, either because of general political polarization, or because some portion of voters have genuine isolationist preferences, remains unclear. Whatever the reason, the saga of former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy is emblematic of the disconnect. Although this story is about Ukraine, in May 2023, McCarthy coincidentally traveled to Israel. Bearing in mind that Israeli-Russian relations were still somewhat amicable, it presented a rare moment where Russians could directly interact with McCarthy. And indeed, during this press conference there, a Russian reporter asked a loaded question. "We know that you do not support weaponry and aid to Ukraine. So is it possible that US policy will change?" McCarthy was perplexed for a second, but then made the reporter likely regret asking the question. "I do not support what your country has done to Ukraine," he said. "I do not support your killing of the children either. And I think, for one standpoint, you should pull out." Months later, McCarthy faced challenges within his caucus to maintain the speaker's gavel. Then he began publicly adopting skeptical rhetoric on funding for Ukraine, that he had a lot of questions about where the money was going and whether it was a good use of taxpayer dollars. Much of this appeared to be political theater, though. When Zelensky visited Washington in September and had a private meeting with McCarthy, the speaker declared that Zelensky had addressed his questions and all was fine with the coalition. Part of what is happening here is a 24/7 news cycle pressure. Every day that passes where Ukraine is in the news but has not made progress on its counteroffensive is further proof that the aid is a waste. To be clear, the slow progress has been far from ideal for Ukraine, and we have discussed before how its current strategy is making a huge and risky bet on Russian mobilization constraints. But the negative attitudes in general surrounding the Ukrainian offensive are overstated, given that Ukraine has made some progress, despite trying to penetrate deeply entrenched Russian positions. In that sense, from Ukraine's perspective, it would be better for US domestic political purposes if Ukraine just stayed out of the news. In other words, reports of no news is worse than having literal no news be reported. And literal no news reported on Ukraine is basically what has happened since the Gaza crisis began. Whereas top stories on the latest Ukrainian drama were commonplace on October 6th, they became either relegated to the back pages or non-existent afterward. Look no further than October 17th. Ukraine destroyed 9 helicopters parked in Berdyansk, marking the long-awaited debut of ATACMS, the aforementioned missile that goes into HIMARS launchers. The 3 daily network news broadcasts in the United States combined to spend 0 minutes and 0 seconds on the story. A month earlier, that would have been crazy. But instead, the focus was on the explosion at the hospital in Gaza, the House Speaker's race, and Chinese jets brushing up against American military flights. However, within the national security community, there is a clear consensus that Ukraine-Russia is the more important conflict for long-term US interests, even if my file photos are fast becoming outdated. Thus, if the White House is left unencumbered, Ukraine will get the tools it needs, which may or may not include a bonus set of aviators. Put differently, the absence of a political focus gives Kyiv more time to cook. Until Gaza settles down, it will take a major event in Ukraine to break through the headlines. If the American media simply forget what is happening on the front lines until something like a Ukrainian siege on Tokmak begins, Kyiv would be better off. Of course, the reverse of that is true as well. If the next major story is a Russian breakthrough, something that Moscow seems to be trying, it will give the appearance that only bad things have happened there, while the world has been distracted. The final point is a short one, and returns to speculation regarding Iran's role. Russia has faced binding capacity constraints on military production since the beginning of the war. That's why they're using old tanks. And it is also why Moscow turned to North Korea and Iran to supplement its stockpiles. The problem is that both of these countries appear relatively capacity constrained as well. In turn, insofar as Iran is currently supplying its proxies in the region, or will start supplying them later, those are weapons that will not make it to the battlefield in Ukraine. And if somehow Iran gets directly involved, the capacity constraints become that much worse. But do you know who is not capacity constrained? The publisher of my book on the causes of Russia's invasion. Heck, you can get a digital copy instantly. Check the video description for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care. This is such a remarkable photo because it perfectly encapsulates both the chaos of that September morning and the era as a whole. You have Bush trying to coordinate the American response, but there was no time to move to a better location, so you can see he is clearly sitting on a chair intended for an 8-year-old. An STU-3 phone has been plugged into the normal phone line to encrypt his communications. People to the side of Bush are perplexed about what is unfolding in real time. Someone on the opposite side is just standing there with a briefcase, seemingly motionless. I thought for a moment that he might be holding the nuclear football, but ultimately it just looks like a normal briefcase. Then you have the cart, which seemingly everyone from my generation recognizes as the beacon of movie day in school back in the 90s and early 2000s. It was a different era. But Ukraine military aid is a tiny fraction of defense spending. Over the first 18 years, ooh,